Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to U.S. History Through Film as we look at the Declaration of Independence through the musical 1776 and its video worksheet. Now, there are many things in this musical that are accurate and many that are not. On the worksheet, number 4, in which John Adams wants his wife to organize the ladies to make saltpeter, and Abigail says every woman wants pins in Massachusetts Bay, are both mostly true. John Adams did ask Abigail to make saltpeter, which in turn was used to make gunpowder, partly because it was normally purchased from overseas, and of course the war made that difficult. Even in East Tennessee, what was then the most remote frontier, Mary Patton, who made gunpowder on the creek known as Powder Branch in what's now Carter County, ordered her saltpeter when she could from Italy. Likewise, Abigail wanted pins, but not just for sewing with. At a time when money was in short supply, pins were actually used as a form of currency. Number 6 refers to Common Sense by Thomas Paine. It was a bestseller, convincing many Americans that it was not common sense that a continent should be ruled by an island. Number 7 is George Washington, who was the commander-in-chief, chosen in large part by John Adams, to make sure that Virginia felt they had a real stake in the Revolutionary War, and the South as a whole, not just New England. Number 8 introduces Richard Henry Lee of Virginia. And Richard Henry Lee is not quite the buffoon he comes across as in the musical, but he did introduce the resolution that the United Colonies were, and of right ought to be, independent states. Although he did not have to go back to Virginia to get that resolution, instructions were simply mailed to him. An interesting bit of film trivia in his musical number, The Lees of Old Virginia, you can see an old fountain in the background, and you may have seen this fountain elsewhere, as it's on a soundstage in Hollywood, if not in another movie, perhaps in a television show Friends, where it appears in the opening segment of every show. So, perhaps an appropriate choice. Now, number 9, the worksheet introduces Dr. Lyman Hall as the new delegate from Georgia. And this was true. As shown in the play, he was a doctor and a minister. Not only was he Georgia's first delegate to Congress, but he played a big role in getting Georgia to send anyone to Congress, as there weren't that many people in Georgia anyway, and most of them weren't that committed to independence at first. During the Revolutionary War, the British burned his farm, but later he would serve as governor of Georgia and play a big role in creating the University of Georgia. Number 12 gives us Edward Rutledge from South Carolina. And as the musical states, he was the youngest signer of the Declaration of Independence, and he would later serve as a state legislator and as the governor of South Carolina. Later in the play, he's presented as a very strong supporter of slavery. Indeed, South Carolina and Georgia were the colonies that insisted that the Declaration not include a criticism of the slave trade, as shown later. Although Rutledge himself was not known to be particularly outspoken on the issue, not perhaps in the way he is in the musical, although he was a slave owner and had, to my knowledge, no objections to the practice. Number 14 introduces Caesar Rodney, George Read, and Thomas McKean from Delaware. And all three of these men were real people. Indeed, this is the only congressional delegation represented in full. These three men were the 3 delegates from Delaware, representing each one of Delaware's 3 counties. George Read was skeptical of independence. Thomas McKean and Caesar Rodney did support it. Although there wasn't the hostile relationship sometimes depicted in the play, in fact, the 3 men were more or less friends. Caesar Rodney really did suffer from cancer that had eaten a hole in his face. That's why he's always shown wearing the patch over his face. He really did cover a disfigured spot with a bandage or a scarf most of the time. And he really did make the dramatic last-minute ride back from Delaware to support independence, as is commemorated on Delaware's state quarter. However, he was not in the bad health depicted in the movie. He was simply home on business. And he lived for 8 more years, until 1784, during which time he would serve as governor of Delaware. James Wilson is mentioned in number 16. And it's true that he doesn't, well, in the play, he does not support independence. But in reality, he did support independence, although at first he wasn't willing to do so officially until he got written instructions from his own district back in Pennsylvania. So they've kind of combined the historical Judge Wilson with a number of other delegates from Pennsylvania, several of whom did oppose independence, for simplicity and for drama in the play. Certainly a majority of Pennsylvanian delegates did oppose independence, but Wilson was among those who, along with Franklin, supported it, and eventually convincing the others, either to support it or, in the case of John Dickinson and one other delegate, simply to not vote. Allowing Pennsylvania finally to vote for independence, sort of as shown in number 75, but only sort of. And really the depiction of James Wilson as kind of a non-entity is not fair. He helped to write Pennsylvania's state constitution and the U.S. Constitution, and eventually served on the U.S. Supreme Court. So the suggestion late in the play that he wants to not be remembered seems pretty unlikely and unfair. Number 19 mentions Benjamin Franklin's son as the royal governor of New Jersey, which he was. That was William Franklin. He was the son of Benjamin Franklin and an unknown mother. And I'm sure she knew who she was. But Franklin acknowledged William and raised him as his own son, and used his significant political influence to get William appointed royal governor of New Jersey. But as the crisis between Britain and America got worse, and Benjamin Franklin was reluctantly but finally decisively pushed into support for independence, he hoped that his son would resign as governor of New Jersey to support him, but instead he didn't, and the two had a real falling out. And as mentioned in the play, in 1776, William Franklin was arrested, stated in number 37, and imprisoned in Connecticut, including 8 months in solitary confinement. He was released in 1778 as part of a prisoner exchange, but he stayed in British-controlled New York City until 1782, at which point he sailed for England and never returned to America. He and his father wrote to each other a few times after the war ended. They once very briefly met in London, but they never really reconciled. Now, William Franklin himself had an illegitimate son in turn, William Temple Franklin, who was also largely raised by his grandfather, Benjamin Franklin, and served as Dr. Franklin's secretary while he was a diplomat in France. Number 21, and later 56 and 57 are all correct. General Sir William Howe did plan to invade New York and New Jersey with the help of his brother, Admiral Lord Richard Howe. Together they had a force of about 25,000 soldiers, about 10,000 sailors, the largest expeditionary force the British would put together prior to the First World War. And ultimately they did seize New York City and hold it for the rest of the war. Number 22 mentions Dr. Josiah Bartlett from New Hampshire. And he was a doctor as well as a politician, did serve as governor of New Hampshire, and his family would remain prominent in New Hampshire politics for a long time to come. Indeed, if you've ever seen the television series The West Wing, which was popular some years ago, the fictional president of the United States in that TV series is supposedly descended from Dr. Josiah Bartlett. Now, number 23 is correct in and of itself. Richard Henry Lee did propose independence with the wording given in the play, But he didn't, as I mentioned earlier, have to go back to Virginia to get that declaration. Rather, he was instructed to declare independence by a message sent to him while he was still in Philadelphia. Indeed, he stayed in Philadelphia for a time, although he did leave Philadelphia before the declaration was signed, but he did sign it next time he was in town. He later served as president of Congress and as a U.S. senator, but never actually served as governor of Virginia, either in 1776, as the play states, or at any other point. Number 26, and elsewhere, New York's delegation abstains, courteously. And New York's delegation did abstain from many votes, including the initial vote on independence, because, as stated in the play, they got no instructions from their state legislature on how to vote, and so they typically abstained. Eventually, though, New York did instruct her delegates to sign the Declaration of Independence, and they finally did so. Number 27, where North Carolina yields to South Carolina, here and elsewhere, is not especially correct. In fact, it offends some people from North Carolina. Not only did their delegate to Congress, Joseph Hewes, support independence on his own, North Carolina had adopted the Mecklenburg Resolves on May 31st, 1775, stating that all laws derived from the authority of the king or parliament are annulled, which some people, especially in North Carolina, where they commemorate this date on their state flag, describe this as the first Declaration of Independence in America. Furthermore, while in the play, Joseph Hewes is constantly yielding to Rutledge of South Carolina, in reality, North and South Carolina are pretty different places. Even in the colonial period, they had very different cultures and economies, and aside from being next to each other and sharing half their name, really weren't much alike or especially close. Number 29, where John Dickinson has no objections to being part of the greatest empire on earth. And number 31, where Benjamin Franklin would like the full rights of an Englishman. Both show how the colonists were proud to be part of a powerful, rich, and free empire, one they felt was the freest on earth, at least until their own traditional rights as Englishmen were ignored. And it would be this that would really lead Americans to support independence. The feeling their government no longer respected their rights, as we can see in number 65 and elsewhere. Number 36 gives us the Reverend John Witherspoon from New Jersey. And he was a delegate to Congress and a Presbyterian minister who served as president of Princeton University for 26 years. Number 46, where John Adams has sent for Martha Jefferson, is not true. Although number 41, where he wanted to go home and see her, was true. But he was concerned about Mrs. Jefferson's health because she had a miscarriage not long before because of a case of gestational diabetes. And so Jefferson worried about his wife's health a lot. Indeed, her health was always poor. She died just a few years later in 1782 at the age of 33. She asked her husband to never marry again, and he didn't. However, she never actually visited her husband in Philadelphia. In fact, the only member of Congress to have his wife nearby was John Dickinson, whose wife lived in Philadelphia. Number 43 gives us Roger Sherman. There's Martha Jefferson, again, who never really visited Philadelphia. Roger Sherman, from Connecticut, did not really play a big role in creating the Declaration of Independence, although he was on the committee, but he played a huge role in creating the U.S. Constitution, particularly the Great Compromise that allowed large states, or populous states, I should say, to be represented in the House of Representatives based on their population, while small states would still have an equal say in the Senate. 2 votes each, a vital compromise that got large and small states to cooperate in accepting the U.S. Constitution. Later, he served in both the House of Representatives and the Senate from Connecticut. Robert Livingston, mentioned in number 44 on the worksheet, is from New York, although he did not go home to celebrate the birth of a child as claimed in his short musical piece. Rather, he was just going home to deal with other political issues. And in fact, while he was on the Declaration Committee, he never voted for or against the Declaration or even signed it, although another of his cousins did sign the U.S. Constitution. Still, Livingston would serve as the highest-ranking judge in New York State, and in that role, he swore George Washington in as President of the United States in America's first inauguration, the Supreme Court not yet having been created. And he was the ambassador to France who negotiated the Louisiana Purchase. And he funded the experiments of Robert Fulton that produced the world's first profitable steamboat, the Clermont, named after his own estate in New York. Number 49, in which he says that only Franklin and General Washington would appear in the history books. Indeed, that Franklin electrified Washington with his lightning rod comes from an actual statement by Adams in a letter he wrote some years ago, or some years later in 1790, saying the history of our revolution will be one continued lie from one end to the other. And that Franklin and Washington would get credit for the whole thing, pretty much as quoted in the movie, although in reality Adams did not mention Washington's horse. Number 52, Samuel Chase is called Old Bacon Face, which in fact was his nickname historically. Later on, Samuel Chase would serve on the U.S. Supreme Court, where he would have the distinction of being the only U.S. Supreme Court justice, so far, to be impeached. Although he was not convicted, the Senate effectively put him on trial to consider removing him from the Supreme Court, but ultimately did not vote to do so. The charge was that his decisions as a Supreme Court judge were too politically biased, which is possible, but the Senate at the time decided that was not a crime you could be removed from office for. Number 54 is not true. The War Committee never went to investigate conditions in New Jersey. That's just to make things flow well in the play. Although Adams, Franklin, and Edward Rutledge later made a trip to New York City in September of 1776 in secret to try to negotiate a ceasefire or peace with General Howe. Of course, the peace meeting was a failure. General Howe felt he could not recognize the Declaration of Independence, and so, of course, could not recognize these men as representing the United States. But some details of the trip, as depicted in the play, are somewhat based on that trip. Number 55, cool, conservative men ensure that fortune thrives, society survives. And this is from the song that Richard Nixon wanted removed from the movie, feeling that it was unfriendly to conservatives like himself. And so it was filmed but removed from the movie, but restored for the director's cut, although because they never finished all the editing, if you watch that part of the director's cut, there are a few scenes where the film quality is of somewhat lower quality, if you know to pay attention to it. Indeed, Jack Warner, many years later, said he regretted removing that part of the film, even at the president's request. Number 60, which Benjamin Franklin says the turkey should symbolize America, is a widely reported myth, although not entirely untrue. Benjamin Franklin did criticize the eagle as a bird that steals fish from other birds, and did say the turkey was a much more respectable bird, mostly for the reasons stated in the movie, although he never quite went so far as to propose the turkey be America's national bird, although it's often stated that he did so it's a common legend. Number 66, South Carolina describes slavery as their peculiar institution. And this brings us to a part of the musical where issues from the mid-1800s are being pulled to the 1770s. The term peculiar institution as a synonym for slavery. It was first used in 1830 by South Carolina politician John C. Calhoun. And peculiar was not meant in this case to mean strange, but simply to mean kind of unique, something specific to them. Indeed, while many people at the time of the American Revolution did criticize slavery, and many slave owners in the South and to some extent elsewhere felt they had to defend it, the way it's expressed in the movie is really taking a lot of debates from the mid-1800s. At the time of the Revolution, many slave owners accepted that slavery was a bad thing. Many accepted it, realized it was evil, that it was not consistent with the ideas of liberty and equality in the pursuit of happiness. But it was something they felt they were stuck with. In the mid-1800s, some people would go further and say it was not just a necessary evil, but a positive good, in which slaves benefited from the protection and guidance of their owners. Likewise, the arguments about states' rights versus central authority, specifically when it came to slavery, is a bit of a later debate, although certainly the debate between state power and central power was part of the American Revolution, and debates about what kind of America we would create. Again, the clear divide between North and South, as implied in the movie, is not really accurate. Indeed, at the time of the Declaration of Independence, slavery was legal in all 13 colonies. A number of Northern delegates to Congress owned slaves, including Stephen Hopkins. Benjamin Franklin had even owned slaves very briefly early in his life. Slavery was particularly important in New York, where a number of farmers owned slaves to work the fields. A number of people in New York City and Albany and elsewhere kept slaves as house servants. And things were not as clear-cut. Number 67, where Thomas Jefferson is resolved to free his slaves, is true, and he did plan to free them upon his death. However, he was so deep in debt that when he died, most of his slaves had to be sold to try to cover some of his debts. A few were freed, but most were not. On the other hand, many other signers of the Declaration of Independence who owned slaves did free them, and particularly Northerners like John Hancock, John Dickinson, and Stephen Hopkins. George Washington freed his slaves upon his death. And Benjamin Franklin, as I mentioned, had owned slaves when he was younger, but turned against slavery in the 1760s, although he did not become an outspoken opponent of slavery till the 1780s, despite what he claims in the play. Number 68 refers to the triangular trade, which could follow a couple different routes. It might, as described in the movie, carry rum to West Africa, or to trade for slaves who were sold in the Caribbean sugar colonies, and molasses purchased there could be taken to New England, turned into rum, which might then go to West Africa. But it might also involve manufactured goods going from Europe to West Africa, again traded for slaves, which would go to some point in the New World, sold various raw materials from the New World, taken to Europe, and then sold and manufactured goods shipped to Africa. But in either case, the route between Africa and the New World was known as the Middle Passage, the middle of that triangle. It was truly brutal, as slaves were packed into cramped and unsanitary conditions for weeks or months. But they were crammed in as tight as they could, many slave traders having concluded that losing a higher percentage of a big cargo was still more profitable in the end than losing a small percentage of a smaller cargo to disease or otherwise suffering from their conditions. Number 76, where Dickinson leaves Congress and joins the militia, is partly true. Dickinson did leave Congress, although not right away, and he did become an officer in the Pennsylvania militia and even helped delay a later British attack on Philadelphia. Furthermore, John Dickinson would later return to Congress and help write the Articles of Confederation that served as a framework of government, kind of a pre-Constitution constitution. The that we would use from 1781 to 1788, and Dickinson served as governor of Delaware, as governor of Pennsylvania, and signed the U.S. Constitution. So this was hardly the end of his career. Number 77 refers to a statement that John Hancock supposedly made when he signed the Declaration of Independence. He signed it with a very large signature, saying it was so Fat George in London could read it without his spectacles. Indeed, John Hancock's signature was so large and so prominent that to this day, if you have to sign something, some may tell you to put your John Hancock on it. Number 79, stating that Lewis Morris has been, his estate has been destroyed and 4 of his sons have been enlisted in the Continental Army, is not entirely correct. For one thing, by this point, in July of 1776, Lewis Morris had left Congress to serve as a general in the New York militia. However, his home was damaged by the British so badly it had to be rebuilt after the war was over, and his three, not 4, but 3 oldest sons did serve in the Revolutionary War. New York did send instructions to their delegates to sign a Declaration of Independence not too long after July 4th, but without instructions on the initial vote, they did abstain. And so it did pass with 12 votes for declaring independence, none against, and 1 abstaining courteously. And number 80. Which Stephen Hopkins wanted to stand by the table where the Declaration was being signed in order to remember everyone's face as he signed it, is not true of Stephen Hopkins, but was true of another delegate from Rhode Island, who they've combined for this scene. William Ellery was another delegate from Rhode Island, and he insisted on watching the signing to remember every man's face as he signed. But Hopkins had his moment as well. When he was watching Stephen Hopkins sign. Hopkins, the oldest member of Congress, except for Benjamin Franklin, suffered from Parkinson's disease. And so when he signed the Declaration of Independence, his hand was shaking. And so William Ellery looked at Hopkins as he was signing with a shaking hand, and Hopkins looked at him and said, "My hand trembles, but my heart does not."